Hello. After years of delay, the Online Safety Bill has passed its last parliamentary hurdle in the House of Lords and is now only waiting for royal assent to become law. A draft version of this bill was published in May 2021, since when the Christian Institute has been running a major campaign to ensure that speech online is as free as it is on the street, whilst ensuring that children in particular are protected from the scourge of internet porn. Now that it is all but law, it seems a good time to take stock of the Online Safety Bill as it is now. What's good, what's not so good, and most importantly, how will it be enforced? With me to do this are our resident experts in this area, researcher Daniel Friery and our head of research, Dave Greatorex. Thanks both. Dave, let me start with you. This dates back to 2019, in fact, in its earliest form, but actually has roots in the Digital Economy Act of 2017. Can you just briefly give us the history that brought us to the point we are today?
Yes, so it was under Theresa May's government in 2019, the Online Harms White Paper. First, that's sort of the initial roots of what became the Online Safety Bill. But as you said before that, in 2017, there was the Digital Economy Act that was passed, and that was doing one element of what the Online Safety Bill is now doing, which was to force pornography sites to have age verification to make sure that those who are accessing their sites were over 18. Now, that was never brought into force.
It was passed, though, wasn't it?
It was passed by Parliament, yes, and given royal assent, but its enforcement being brought into force depended on subsequent regulations, which were never brought forward by the government. And so the Online Safety Bill, soon to be Act, actually repeals the relevant Part 3 of the Digital Economy Act. But the concerns were always there around the question of harm, even back there in the Online Harms White Paper in 2019. We raised concerns at the time about the free speech implications of that. The government went away after that consultation, brought back the draft bill, by that time renamed the Online Safety Bill, and that was scrutinised by a joint committee of Parliament, so members of the House of Lords and the House of Commons. And they made various recommendations, and the final legislation has just been through all of its parliamentary stages.
Yeah, and we were there right from the beginning, really. And let's start with one of the big early issues that we were talking about. So the bill puts duties on social media companies like Facebook, search engines like Google, to protect children and adults from illegal and originally harmful content as well. And I think most people, illegal content is easy to understand. And now people might also think that harmful content is, well, by definition, harmful, therefore bad, and thinking, so what's the problem here? So perhaps you can, Daniel, you can explain the slightly different approaches the legislation was taking towards adults and children, and also the significance of this distinction between illegal and harmful.
Yeah, well, I would say firstly that it's important to make the distinction between illegal content and harmful content, because it allows the opportunity more clearly for Parliament to scrutinise and really decide where the major issues are, rather than leaving it to the ambiguity of tech bosses in Silicon Valley to decide. And so with a legal offence, say, as the bill is introduced on self-harm, the government can set clear limits. What is self-harm? Define it in a very precise way, and that gets voted on, and a majority in Parliament get to approve that. Whereas if you were to say vaguely, we want to prevent tech companies promoting harmful content, and that definition is left, there's not that accountability and decision-making process as to what that actually is. And we know that tech bosses have a bit of a reputation for taking overly broad interpretations of phrases like violent or harmful or abusive, and just switching them out of context.
Yes, because we've known, for example, our good friend Peter Saunders, who had a video dealing with the issue of transgenderism. That was on YouTube, and that got removed. So we're talking about our concerns were around that sort of entirely legitimate, often Christian based content that was going to be viewed as harmful by the Silicon Valley execs.
Yeah, absolutely. And Peter Saunders is a great example. Dr. Carl Trueman, a US Christian academic, is another a good example. He had a video on YouTube censored, which was merely just a sort of analysis of American attitudes towards sexual morality and how they've changed over time. And these are the kinds of things that, if left to tech bosses, if left with the pressure of potential huge fines of up to 10% of global turnover, decisions made to censor and to cut those things, even if there's not a direct requirement for those things to necessarily be removed.
And for the ordinary Christian as well,
Mm-hmm.
there was a concern too, wasn't there, that just day-to-day kind of conversations, Christian conversations about ethical issues, they might also be affected.
Yeah, I mean, we live in a very contentious age. You just have to go and see some of the big protests that are taking place across the world, maybe in the US, but also probably here on our doorstep, to see that we're living in a very polarized society, in a society where one side would like to shut the other side down. Just coming back to your point before as well on the distinction between adults and children, I think it's important that we recognise that this was going to apply to adults, because there is an argument to be made that, you know, in addition to sort of the main responsibility to protect children lying with parents, there is a greater responsibility on the state to ensure that children are protected from known known evils. I mean, you just think of the appalling situation that I'm sure many Christian Institute supporters will be aware of with Molly Russell, who was bombarded with self-harm material online, and the coroner concluded that was a contributing factor to her subsequent suicide. And so it's important that where adults need to take responsibility towards children, that the government encourage and promote that. But here we're talking about adults who surely have the ability to make their own minds up. They're rational people, can make their own judgments. So it's an important distinction to be made.
And there was good news in this area, wasn't there? So we let supporters know. I mean, we were engaging our supporters very early on, got them engaged in writing letters to parliamentarians, having meetings with various officials, because of our concern over how this phraseology of legal but harmful might be used. And the government listened to us, Dave, and made some changes. Tell us about that.
That's right. I mean, it's important to acknowledge that one of the difficulties, I suppose, with working on this legislation has been that we so fully support many aspects of what it's trying to do, not least the protection of children, and that was never the concern. But it became this issue that when you're applying the same legal but harmful threshold to adults, it's a different ballgame. And we were concerned, along with others, about that really this is infantilizing everybody, and it's not giving adults the opportunity to engage with arguments. And so that was the basis of our case really to the government. It was focused on the free speech aspect, and as you mentioned earlier on, we wanted the freedom of speech around controversial issues perhaps, but all issues to be the same online as it is offline. That was our key benchmark. And I think really that was probably in line with a lot of what the government was thinking themselves, and certainly when there was a bit of a change in the administration, a new Secretary of State came in, Michelle Donnellan, and she seemed more open to those free speech arguments. And it was in her time in office that concession was made, and the government agreed that they would drop the legal but harmful provisions as they relate to adults, still remain in place for children, but drop them for adults, and replace them with really what we were calling for, which was provisions that empower adults to shape their online environment a bit more. So that gives them the tools to decide they don't want to see certain content. So the power rests with the users rather than with the tech bosses and the tech companies that are filtering content out so that an adult never actually has the opportunity to engage with it.
And it's just worth saying that we're very grateful to Institute supporters that took on board the arguments we were making and engaged with perhaps their MPs.
Absolutely.
To make the argument, because as you can see, it made a difference. Good things were made better, bad things were removed. So that's the legal but the harmful aspect of it. So that's great. But there was a whole other aspect to the bill that we were very concerned with, and that was the area of ensuring that children were adequately protected. As you said, we were always keen that that was the case. And pornography was a big area of that for us. Just tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, as Dave mentioned earlier, pornography was the real key plank of Part 3 of the Digital Economy Act in 2017, and something that was never brought into force. And the government promised that at the time that the Online Safety Bill would do that and more. And it would cover social media sites and search engines promoting pornographic content as well. And yet, to the shock really of many of the campaigners, when the bill was first brought forward, it actually missed regulated pornographic companies that Part 3 of the Digital Economy Act was seeking to regulate. So that was one real shock. The second real shock was that the standards set out in the Digital Economy Act weren't reflected in the Online Safety Bill. We want to ensure that any age verification system is robust, it's effective, it identifies age to the day, it doesn't just guesstimate and try and work out from your facial features how old you might be. And so we want age verification that is clear. And that's now what we've got after much campaigning, particularly in the House of Lords by Lord Bethell and others. The government committed to bringing forward that robust, effective, highly effective age verification, which is a real key demand that we were asking for.
And on both sides then, perhaps on the legal but harmful side and on the pornography side, what gaps remain at the point it is now?
Sure. Well, so while legal but harmful has been removed, and we welcome the replacement provisions around user empowerment, there is still some slight concerns, perhaps around the way those things might work in practice.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you about enforcement in a minute. Yeah,
it remains to be seen how tech companies, or what they put in their terms of service, the T&Cs for users, and what power they take to themselves, and how consistently that works. What remains to be seen. And on pornography, Daniel mentioned the Digital Economy Act. The definition in there of pornography was more robust, perhaps, than we see in the Online Safety Bill as well.
I think it's also probably worth mentioning there's some things that the government could have done now around pornography that they've kicked the can down the road along. Yeah, the review, exactly. The government have committed to looking at the sort of picture of offences, legal offences around pornography to ensure that there's no sort of gaps or holes that should be closed up. Baroness Floella Benjamin's been a stalwart campaigner on this whole issue for many years, really, and she's identified this hole whereby in the offline world there are videos, pornographic videos with, say, childlike actors or family members that are prevented from being distributed in the offline world, but are still allowed to be circulated on the online world. This sort of content really has no place in our society at all. It's normalizing evil attitudes towards children, and needs to be stopped. The government could have done that now, but instead they've kicked the can down the road.
It's difficult to understand why they took that approach. I want to talk to you about enforcement, because as we know only too well, it's one thing having the bill, and however good a bill it might be, and it's a very different thing enforcing what the law says when it comes into law. So just tell us, what does the bill have to say about enforcement, and what are our concerns about how that may operate?
Well, a huge amount of the enforcement responsibility rests with Ofcom, which is the regulator that the bill has identified for this whole area. At one point, when we talked about the online harms white paper, there was talk of a separate regulator that could have been created specifically to enforce the new regime, and that might have been preferable rather than loading on this whole new area to Ofcom's existing remit. But that being said, it's now Ofcom's responsibility. There are concerns about that because of Ofcom's failure really to enforce existing provisions around video sharing platforms. So provisions which parallel in many ways the new online safety bill regime, but which they've been in place for a good 2 years or more, and they've not been enforcing those restrictions as we believe they should have been. So they've been slow to act in that regard, and the hope is that they're not similarly slow with regard to the online safety regime.
I mean, it's hard to sort of underestimate really the scale of the challenge. I mean, when they were dealing with the video sharing platforms regime, they were UK-based companies, a handful. Now we're talking, Ofcom's own estimate is 100,000 plus companies brought into the scope of this regulation. How are they going to have everything in place? And I think one of the solutions to this is going to be them thinking about how they can creatively engage with other sectors, financial services, that help enable the business model of these platforms. One of the things that we pointed out during our campaign in this area is that the most effective removal of illegal pornographic content online was 10 million videos removed from Pornhub's website only when Visa and MasterCard said they're going to pull their financial services. So if we're going to see a robust enforcement of this regime, I think it's going to take more than Ofcom. It's going to have to lean into these broader areas and broader sectors and cooperate and work together so that we can have the most effective regime to protect our children.
And those kind of business disruption measures, again, were included in the Digital Economy Act and haven't been carried forward into this. And it was an amendment that we put down in the House of Lords to try and replicate really what the Digital Economy Act had done, and sadly it wasn't successful.
Well, let me try and sum up then. In terms of free speech and how that balances against dealing with illegal content and harmful content for children, we're pretty happy. Could have been better, but we're pretty happy. On the pornography side and other harms towards children, it's good. It's certainly a lot better than it was before this was brought in, but it could have been better. So it's a bit of a missed opportunity. And the big question mark now then is over enforcement. How will Ofcom deal with the powers that they have given the scale of the task? And that's something we're going to have to keep a close watch on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, thank you both very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For more great content, like, subscribe and hit the notification bell.